Matt Folger and Evan Spadoni. This is episode 14, Antebellum 3, John C. Calhoun versus John C. Calhoun. We take a look at the life of John C. Calhoun and his complete reversal from going from a nationalist patriot after the War of 1812 to a sectional representative of the most extreme slave oligarchy factions in South Carolina. If you like this podcast, please share it on Facebook, Twitter, or Pinterest, or whatever you got, Google Plus, whatever it is. And I hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening.
And then this sort of conversation had this crescendo of where they listed out all these problems, and then it just died. They were like, all right, well, I gotta go. And they all scattered.
These are the problems of society. Well, see you later.
See you later. And then they said, well, what can you do? There was that sort of conversation. Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do?
Yeah.
I guess we'll just go home and read as well. First off, this person boasted about how smart they were, like, earlier in this conversation.
Oh, that's always nice.
I was like, I know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff. Pretty smart.
I always love those people.
And
it's like the knowing just enough to think you know something, and then before you kind of the ever-widening world of knowledge in which you just, the more you learn, the more you know that you know nothing kind of thing, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's always great when someone's boasting about how much they know.
So she said that earlier in the conversation, and then at the end of the conversation, she just was like, well, what can you do? I'm going to just go home and read.
Shut the sandwich, yeah.
And
that's great.
So when I was buying my books, I went up and I talked to the main counter guy who also proclaimed that he was intelligent. Like, I'm kind of the resident expert of philosophy and
I'm sure.
Poetry is what he said. And I asked him, like, a lot of these conversations end this way. Why do these conversations always end with this sort of, what are you going to do? Oh, I just go turn inward. And his response was, well, these are really big problems and they're overwhelming, and these problems are so monumental that they're overwhelming. And I was like, okay, I study this stuff too, and right now we're studying the lead up to the Civil War. And these problems that we're experiencing right now are nothing compared to the problems they were facing leading up to the Civil War.
Yeah.
Not even
close.
Not even close.
Yeah.
And that's what I said. I was like, I don't think these problems are that big.
It's interesting defining a problem as monumental, right? Because it's like, it has a solution which takes the form of an idea. Now, the implementation might be something else, but they're not even talking about implementation. They're not just talking about the monumental scope of the problem, as if it's just unsolvable or something.
Mm-hmm. They have this laundry list of problems, which was a correct diagnosis, and then no solution, and they all scattered.
That's the typical, yeah.
It was like, we don't have a trade tariff. Like a 15% trade tariff.
Like, what's that? What's a tariff?
Would be a huge deal.
Would be massive, yeah. Monumental, even.
Yeah, perhaps.
Oh, God. Well, that's why we do what we do. People need
to understand these aren't that big of, like, these problems we have. This sort of Ragnarok apocalyptic view, and I was at a coffee shop doing research, and this baby boomer accosted me. What are you researching?
Accosted.
It looks interesting. I do this podcast and I'm doing research on in the run up to the Civil War. He's like, oh, we're gonna have a Civil War. We're gonna have another one. I was like, yeah. You sure, brah? If you really believe that, then you should be focusing almost all your energy in preventing it, or you're morally insane.
Well, plus, then look at the Civil War. It was you had two incompatible economic systems with each their own oligarchies that were radically opposed to each other.
Yeah,
that was the basis for the Civil War. When you have one oligarchy, a Wall Street centered oligarchy, with the peripheral kind of industrial, Fortune 50 GEs and Boeings and Halliburtons and Lockheeds, they kind of are led by the financier class. There's no basis, there's no nucleus there for resistance for a civil war. So just diagnostically, they don't even know what brings about civil wars or the American Civil War. It's just really just absurd. It's like the Hillsdale people telling me we're going to have a civil war based on gun rights. Like, wow, okay, that's your level of political analysis? Or these, people that you're mentioning at the bookstore. Well, I know a lot about this. It's like, really? Well, shouldn't the proof be in your predictions, right? Like, if you could see what's happening before it happens, wouldn't that be, the test of your theory of politics? To see if what you think is going on is actually going on, if it's vetted by future occurrences.
You have to have solutions.
Yeah, solutions too. Yeah.
Solutions are the main thing. You
Sure.
have to be able to diagnose a problem and then offer counter to it.
A few minor things with the economists to touch on. Always love things like this. Let me check that out. It's small business friendliness matrices, right? And then it's always, whenever they do these reports, it's like the most actual entrepreneurial, biggest economies with the best cutting-edge technologies and industries and markets are always like in their worst rated entrepreneurial guide or gauge, right? That's how they always do things. They're saying, oh, this area is really bad for entrepreneurs. You know, California is just a horrible place for a business climate. Comparing it to what? Yeah, and they're looking at like Arkansas as like the city on the hill of like.
Really, that's how they measure it.
Well, you know, yeah, all the
it's
metrics
all based
are like,
on tax code.
See, when the economist looks at a map of the United States and says, these are the best states for business and this is not the best states for business, the economist doesn't represent business. It represents finance capital. It represents money's freedom to do whatever it wants. And so what do you need to actually run a modern industrial technological business? Well, you need employees, you need education,
infrastructure.
You need infrastructure, you need people that know the technology, or
Healthcare, you need healthy workers.
yeah, people that can be creative and industrial. Look at the
Ability
Silicon
to
Valley,
move.
right?
Yeah.
And so in California here, California has an F grade, the worst grade, failing for small business friendliness. It's like California has a bigger economy than most countries, right? So areas like Oklahoma, like Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky,
Low
Tennessee,
wage, Walmart
sweatshop style, Walmart job economies. This is how they hide what they're doing. Is they say, oh, we represent business, when they're just representing the Peter Schiff model of extraction economics, where the quickest way they can turn a buck and make a profit, make more money out of the money that they have, is the best way to facilitate it.
Do they have anything on cheap credit for small business?
I'm sure not. It's all about deregulation.
That's something that could maybe help.
No, yeah, they're like, deregulate these areas. But of course, when it comes to credit, whoa, hey, that's what they represent. This is the creditor
That's
class.
sacrosanct.
Yeah, exactly. You can't talk about that. This is not at all. It's just so self-interested. It's amazing that this gets by. Anyway, another article here is Charlemagne loosening the Union. Britain and the EU, they were running Cameron to head up the European Commission to replace Barroso, who's on the way out, but Jean-Claude Juncker got the nomination. And so now Britain's realizing that they've been way out on this limb of like, oh, we're going to leave the EU. We need, the UK or Independence Party and all this nonsense. It's just...
I heard Colin Quinn describe the relationship between Britain and France, and I think it works really well for this situation. It's John Cusack in Say Anything with the boombox, trying to get Europe to want to be with them. It's just no one cares. Go leave. Oh, it's way worse for you if you do.
They're out there just pompously parading themselves. I was like, oh, we're going to leave the EU. Oh, we're going to whatever. I don't even know. Just all these threats. Mostly it's just, secession over the EU. As if that would do more damage to the EU than it would do to Britain.
Well, they needed a scapegoat for their terrible economy.
Yeah.
So they can blame the EU. It's the politics. It's a safe enemy. It's a safe scapegoat. You're not attacking, the city of London.
Yeah.
You can say, this EU is destroying your jobs. This is Portuguese.
They're just flailing around. You really, over the past few years, you're seeing the weakness of the British being going down just precipitously. It's just falling off a cliff. They're threatening to leave the EU. Of course, they realize that if they leave the EU, it's going to be way worse for them than anyone else. So this is all just done as fluff and desperation. Really, I mean, this is what other kind of threats could one be wielding out than this level of caliber of threats of not getting their way. Another story here: cabling Africa's interior. A dogged firm with roots in Zimbabwe has brought fast broadband to landlocked parts of Africa, the continent that infrastructure forgot. That's obviously silly, but so a company, Liquid Telecom, they're running internet, high-speed internet cable, fiber optic to Zambia, parts of Africa, southern Southwest Africa, basically. Centered in Zimbabwe, and they got these cable grids here.
Yeah, that could be an incredible thing if you got internet access in rural Africa. That would be amazing.
Yeah, and kind of up by Kenya and Sudan, and those are Uganda, areas like that. They've had, that's the kind of the area they've been following with the micropayments and the smartphone payments, making a suitable credit system for people, small businesses. Now this is extending further down into Southwest Africa, kind of the hub in Zimbabwe, going up to Zambia and Botswana, down to South Africa, over across through Zambia to Tanzania. So,
hopefully this leads to more capital-intensive infrastructure, things like dams.
Education and social, just part of the global community and able to give a voice for what's going on. I mean, you're really seeing how that's really impacting this whole latest Palestinian bloodbath, is when everyone has a smartphone and has internet access, they can, stream the atrocities right away, and it's really good about exposing all this stuff really rapidly. Anyway, so, here's Zimbabwe being the central hub of developing this part of interior Southwest Africa. The case in point of why they're always in the crosshairs of the imperialists. Last Economist article here. So the Economist is coming out on the Export-Import Bank. Evan, can you guess what side of it they are?
They don't like it because it lowers their interest rates they can charge.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. They call it beggar thy neighbor banking. Export credit agencies are an enduring instrument of mercantilism. Ooh, there's that word.
Well, mercantilism. What does that mean?
Yeah, this is their mythological, just kind of, pre-World War I block economies, and everyone with the tariff closed off. Subsidized loans for exports have long been recognized as a form of mercantilism, and is why rich countries struck a gentleman's agreement in 1978 to curb them. Signatories to the OECD arrangement agree to maximum loan maturities, commercially based interest rates, and minimum risk premiums for insurance. China is, of course, not privy to this, so the whole problem with the Export-Import Bank is if other countries provide subsidies and encouragements to manufacturers, and you don't, then it's not an even playing field, right? So the participants are not a bunch of autonomous individuals exchanging with each other in a market economy. It's states interacting with each other in a global market economy, and so you have to make compensations if someone else is giving a driver or stimulus to industrial exports. You have to do something to counteract that, or else it's not a level playing field, right? So when you're talking about free market, ultimately in the abstract ideal of that, what me and Evan try to represent is actually that. But, in terms of a level playing field, where you'd actually have more honest competition rather than, someone doing this and someone not doing this. And the thing is, you can't ensure that no one's going to do this, because if one country does it, then that provides a stimulus to exports. And every country should do this, because not only, it's not like they're cheating, it's like they're encouraging actual industrial capitalism to exist, which isn't just a self-evident thing in terms of market economics. The market would much rather do what they have on this other, the supposed market of the financier class wanting a return would much rather do what they're saying in this article, red tape blues, of just deregulating all the economies and having a race to the bottom. That's the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, it's disastrous, though.
Tending to pollution, that provides extra costs, so we're not going to do that either. Everything just raise and pillage economics, slash and burn economics, yeah.
And also, with an Export-Import Bank, you can give out contracts and have them be based with more fair labor standards, give preferential treatment to companies that do that in far heavy infrastructure industry, because it's a publicly run bank.
Yeah, ultimately, right. I mean, what promotes industrial economics is good, because in the objective reality world, you need infrastructure.
I think we should be building 15 Cape Canaveral, but 15 cities around a country. Make space a major priority.
Well, we can't get on the Russian shuttles anymore, so I guess we'll have to
do
something. I haven't followed that exactly, but is there anyone actually stranded in a space station?
I doubt it.
There's an American in the International Space Station trying to pretend like he's Russian. So anyway, the last glimpse here of the beggar thy neighbor Export-Import Bank thing. The world would be better off without subsidized export credits. Failing that, the best solution would be for the OECD arrangement to cover more types of lending, though America has hoped by this year that China would agree to international guidelines on export credits. There is no sign yet.
Yeah, good luck.
Keep holding your breath.
Yep.
In the meantime, American companies will fight hard to keep Export-Import Bank alive. They will likely succeed. So Xi Jinping, the new Prime Minister of China, they're in for 10-year terms. So Hu Jintao is in there for 10 years. Xi Jinping is going to be in there for another 9 years. He has consolidated power really rapidly. He is not going to permit the removal of the Chinese equivalent of the Export-Import Bank for the next 9 years. So keep holding your breath, economist. You're not going to get anywhere with this. This is just pathetic. The problem is the British have gripped American polities so well, and they continue to do so just from the inertia of history. And they're so weak and pathetic now, and they're just crumbling apart in terms of their global international power structures. But the American people are just so fat and happy and stupid, and the old Cold War warrior class and the baby boomers are just so cozy, just drifting forward. There's no ideological resistance to this just garbage that they're just puking out, right? So they're just continuing to go with the same old crap, and it's not going to work. This ruling class is just totally feckless.
Yeah, these arguments are pretty poor.
There's the same old crap just over and over again.
With any sort of look into things, you can easily see who they serve, and that is the financial class, which is the most destructive class of oligarchy.
They want their return, and they want it now, and they don't care where it comes from. So we're talking about, we're jumping into James Henry Hammond and the Old South, A Design for Mastery by Drew Gilpin Faust. Great book. It's about a South Carolinian man who was very ambitious and had to climb the social ladders at the time, through this really cutthroat social Darwinian system in South Carolina, where the only way to make money was basically inheritance, slavery, and not much else.
Yes, this is 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. Well, it sort of shows through this one guy's life who is, I would describe him as a purely ambitious, almost, animal, where he's going to do whatever it takes to rise in his surroundings, and that was the slave system and getting in with the planter class. That's what he does, is anything but that. And he's pretty smart and industrious, try to do scientific farming. But what it shows, really, is the dichotomy between the North and the South, and how, in the North, the absence of a national bank led to chaos. And if you're a farmer, your line of work is already really chaotic. You've got to deal with droughts, floods, hail sometimes, market fluctuations, and then you take away the stability of a national banking system, and you go to the boom and bust cycle of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, just adding on this, and this creates this animosity towards the North that is felt in a real way by everyday people in the South.
Yeah, everyone's laboring under this really backward system that doesn't work for anyone involved, other than the delusions of the 1% or delusions of grandeur in the slave oligarchy, and then everyone has to blame everything on someone else. But since of the social degradation and the lack of humility, they blame everything on others than themselves.
Yeah, it never comes up to we should invest in infrastructure, or we should develop some of our crops locally, like refine these cottons, make textile mills and things like that. That never comes up. Like, he takes a trip to Texas or there, and he complains about how difficult the journey is. And this is in the age of the railroad. Doesn't talk about, well, you need a railroad from Charleston to, I don't know, what would be to Sam Houston. So it shows that the really only answer that they ever came up with was war. There was either, dissolution of the Union. It was the only answer they were able, of the planning class, was ever able to come up with.
Yeah, have you ever known anyone that has a huge problem, like an alcoholic or drug addict, or someone that just has some kind of really severe emotional issue, and they never confront their own problem? And then so the projection just starts going on, where they see everything else is causing their problems, because they're not willing to face the fact that they're their own problem. This is the South, right? This is the mentality of the Southern ruling class. They were convinced that they were civilizing the blacks. I don't know how long you have to be a slave and how long you have to be in a system in which, if you learn how to read, you're going to be killed or whipped to death. Where you're, extirpating any sense of industry and labor and frugalness and education and self-improvement in a population so you can keep them subjected and then saying you're civilizing them. This is the nonsense and the dichotomy that's going on in the South.
And you can't contain slavery because it's a negative growth industry. So it has to expand. You have to consume more property with slavery. And that was just going to run up right against, the free labor movement of the North that wanted these new territories. And because they could not see any other way than keep slavery, that it just led to this disastrous conflict. Yeah, what I'm taking away from most of this book is they could not come together for any solution. And they created this culture of militarism.
Chivalry,
yeah, the chivalric culture of militarism, which, just sort of, well, of course we can, we'll whip the Yankees in a month. Never being any real strategists. If you were really trying to secede, we're going to need some cannon factories. We're going to need bullet factories. We're going to need rail networks. All these important things that if you're a real, thinker, you're actually going to try to succeed instead of, our fighting spirit.
Well, it's almost that since the whole culture was built on denial, that was their strongest point anyway. Right? So they could just do something that made no rational sense and all rally around it because that was just the strength of the denial, the faith in a bad sense of the system. It was like their support of the nullification thing was like, well, you elect representatives, they have a House, they have a Senate. If they approve both the houses, they get signed by the president. Everyone has a vote. It's representative. But if that doesn't work, then we have a backstop if we can just nullify anything we don't like. What? How does that make any sense? We are the kings of this little feudal fiefdom that we have, and that's the end of it. Calhoun, which is interesting. The two things I want to touch on with Calhoun is his speech in 1816, total support of the tariff, sounds like Hamilton. And then his thing in 1828, total reversal. It's totally unconstitutional. It's a total, neo-Smithian argument for free trade. It's really quite remarkable.
Well, yeah, if you're he's bending to the winds of he's got to stay in power. That's like the planting class wants free trade.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Free trade and slavery and low wages, low to no wages.
Low prices.
Always
low prices, always. So we're going to spin away from James Henry Hammond here for a second and talk about John C. Calhoun, the one and only. He rose to prominence as being, part of the triumvirate of the Warhawks, Clay, Webster, Calhoun, for the War of 1812. His best years were his early years, and he became more and more reactionary as time went on. As a real exposition on the proof that we were discussing of the post-war consensus of 1812, you had a speech on the tariff bill by John C. Calhoun in 1816, April 4th. So the economy, the country is in such disarray, such catastrophe and chaos, that even the South, its leading spokespeople, are seeing the wisdom of having a tariff and having a domestic fostered economy. So here's some excerpts here from this. The debate heretofore on this subject has been on the degree of protection which ought to be afforded to our cotton and woolen manufacturers, all professing to be friendly to those infant establishments, and to be willing to extend to them adequate encouragement. So, also, it's very worthy of noting that during this time you had the embargo, 1807, right? So the embargo kicks in, then so trade is cut off. So that's like talk about tariffs, that's like an infinity tariff, right?
Yeah.
You can't even buy from these other countries, so you better learn how to manufacture this stuff for yourself. So these manufacturers come into, there's a bit of a dislocation, of course, from doing something that abruptly. It's not well advised to do that.
Yeah, you don't want to slam it in reverse.
Yeah, going 40 one way and just slam it in reverse and go the other way. I mean, you can encourage these things through a process that does not cause massive upheaval and dislocation through tariffs.
25% would be a big step.
But due to the incompetence and
or sort of radicalism of Jefferson,
and the his whole rights of man, really just his own Rousseauian kind of conceptions, really, I guess. That the embargo kicks in, you have these manufacturers that start coming to a certain prominence, and then so you have, by the end of the War of 1812, you have some manufacturers. Now, when you're going, the Treaty of Ghent, 1814, actually, before the war is technically over. It kind of is over, and then there's another battle where Jackson has the victory of New Orleans in 1815. But as it concludes, it's like, okay, well, trade is going to start to normalize again. And we have these manufacturers that we built up over the past 7 years. What do we do about them? We should probably protect them with some kind of tariff so they aren't just swept away. And so Calhoun is saying, hey, this idea of a tariff, not a bad idea. Maybe we should do something with it.
Yeah, like the bonus bill for public works.
Yeah, all manners of encouragements.
1817.
All right, so he says, the security of a country mainly depends on its spirit and means, the later principally of its moneyed resources. Modified as industry of this country is now, combined with our particular institution. So he's, this is how they refer to the slave class. Is
of course.
They're on particular institution.
And they never, you can see the shame.
Yeah.
You can't call it what it is.
Right, our own particular institution. In want of a naval ascendancy, whether we have the misfortune to be involved in a war with a nation dominant on the ocean, and it is almost with such, the compressed be, blah, 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 the moneyed resources of the country to be a great extent must fail. So if we don't have a powerful navy, and we're reliant on foreign commerce, and we're at war with the foreign power that's dominant on the seas, our trade and currency is going to be ruined. And that's what happened. So he's just saying, okay, this is what had happened. We took it for granted that it was the duty of this body to adopt these measures of prudent foresight in which the event of war made necessary. We cannot presume to be indifferent to the dangers of abroad, unless indeed the House is prepared to indulge in the phantoms of eternal peace, which seem to possess the dream of some of its members. Could such a state exist, no foresight or fortitude would be necessary to conduct the affairs of the Republic, but since it is a mere illusion of the imagination, as every people that has or ever will exist are subjected to the vicissitudes of peace and war, it must be considered as a plain dictate of wisdom in peace to prepare for war. What then, let us consider, constitute the resources of this country, and what are the effects of war on them? Commerce and agriculture, till lately almost the only, still constitute the principal sources of our wealth. So long as these remain uninterrupted, the country prospers, but war, as we are now circumstanced, is equally destructive to both. They both depend on foreign markets, and our country is placed, as it regards them, in a situation strictly insular. A wide ocean rolls between. Our commerce neither is nor can be protected by the present means of the country. What, then, are the effects of a war with the maritime power of England? Our commerce annihilated, spreading individual misery and producing national poverty. Our agriculture, cut off from its accustomed markets, the surplus product of the farmer perishes on his hands and ceases to produce because he cannot sell. Our resources are dried up, while his expenses are greatly increased, as all manufactured articles, the necessities as well as the conveniences of life, rise to an extravagant price. The recent war fell with particular pressure on the growers of cotton and tobacco and other great staples of the country, and the same state of things will occur in the event of another, unless prevented by the foresight of this body. Yeah. Imagine Saudi Arabia right now being cut off from all foreign commerce.
Yeah.
How quickly they would look at the oil on their hands and be like, well, this seems so much more valuable when we could exchange it for everything else in the world. And the ultimate fundamental problem of the North and South economies, right? The South was an economy like Saudi Arabia in modern day. Mm-hmm. Very backward, very totally extraction driven, right? Imagine what Saudi Arabia is going to be like when they run out of oil.
A desert.
Afghanistan, it's going to be just totally impoverished unless they develop some technological know-how, industry, fostering creative enterprise in their country, and they can do it. But the curse of the resource richness, it's like growing up fantastically wealthy. Like what interest do you have? What hunger do you have for learning anything in general? That's a big problem that if you're wealthy that you have with your kids. You really have to instill a sense of industry and work ethic and a hunger and passion for life, because they can just be lazy nepotistic
layabouts.
Yeah. So anyway, if the mere statement of facts did not carry conviction to every mind, as he conceives it is calculated to do, additional arguments might be drawn from the general nature of wealth. Neither agriculture, manufactures, nor commerce, taken separately, is the cause of wealth. It flows from the three combined, and cannot exist without each. The wealth of any single nation or individual, it is true, may not immediately depend on the three, but such wealth always proposes their existence. He viewed the words in the most enlarged sense. Without commerce, industry would have no stimulus. Without manufactures, it would be without the means of production. And without agriculture, neither of the others can subsist. When separated entirely and permanently, they perish. War in this country produces, to a great extent, that effect, and hence the great embarrassment which follows in its train. The failure of wealth and resources of the nation necessarily involved in the ruin of its finances and its currency. So anyway, this sounds like Hamilton.
Yeah.
This is what happens when these oligarchs and these very petty, myopic, self-interested forces play out their dominant theories in the public sphere. Is it doesn't work, and then the nation is faced with catastrophe, and then the more humble and patriotic of them is willing to admit it. Like Calhoun at this time, at least, is like, hey, this is a disaster. We should do something about this. So here's something else also. Our currency is also sure to experience the shock and become so deranged as to prevent us from calling out fairly whatever the means is left of the country. The result of a war in the present state of our naval power is the blockade of our coast and consequent destruction of our trade. The wants and habits of the country, founded on the use of foreign articles, must be gratified. Importation to a certain extent continues, through the policy of the enemy, or unlawful traffic. The exportation of our bulky articles is prevented. 2. The specie of our country is drawn to pay the balance perpetually, accumulating against us, and the final result is a total derangement of the currency. Total collapse of international exchange, right? Trade deficit is what he's talking about. Massive trade deficit where they can't pay, so you're going to go into debt to foreign powers.
Yeah, which is what's happening right now.
Yeah, and the difference now from then, though, is, of course, we have a reserve currency, and we can go into debt to these foreign powers because they use it between other national exchange. Of course, if that was limited and these other countries just used dollars to exchange with us, we would be in a situation of very compounded poverty for a bit. And, unless we got a recovery program going at that time, it would be really ugly.
Yeah, and the BRICS countries are looking to do that.
Yeah.
They want to get out of this yoke. Now, if we had a real economy, things would be different.
Yeah, they could be buying thorium reactors from us or something like that.
Yeah. With our Export-Import Bank using
cancer vaccines, things like that. AIDS vaccines, whatever,
That got cheap insurance from the Export-Import Bank.
Mm-hmm. The restrictive measures in the war, though not intended for that purpose, have, by the necessity operative of things, turned out a large amount of capital to this new branch of industry. Right, so the embargo caused a bunch of domestic capital to immediately go into manufacturers because they're like, oh, well, this is a disaster, but at least we're protected right now from, being in war, from the foreign dumping mechanisms of these foreign monopolies. He had often heard it said, both in and out of Congress, that this effect alone would indemnify the country for all its losses. So high was this tone of feeling, when the want of these establishments was practically felt, that he remembered during the war, and some of the questions. Then he said that the war alone furnished sufficient stimulus, and perhaps too much, as it would make their growth unnaturally rapid, but that, on the return of peace, it would then be time for us to show our affection to them. He had, at that time, did not expect an apathy and aversion to the extent which is now seen. But it will no doubt be said that if they are so far established, and if their situation of the country is so favorable to their growth, where is the necessity of affording them protection? It is to put them beyond the reach of contingency. Besides, capital is not yet, and cannot be for some time, adjusted to the new state of things. There is, in fact, from the operation of temporary causes, a great pressure on these establishments. They had extended so rapidly during the late war that many, he feared, were without the requisite surplus of capital or skill to meet the present crisis. Should such prove to their fact, it would give a backset and mind to a great extent endanger their ultimate success. Should the present owners be ruined, and the workmen dispersed and turned to other pursuits, the country would sustain a great loss.
Yeah.
Such would, no doubt, be the fact to a considerable extent if not protected. Besides, circumstances, if we act with wisdom, are favorable to attract to our own country much skill and industry. The country in Europe, having the most skillful workmen, is broken up. So, talking about the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars. It is to us, if widely used, more valuable than the repeal of the Edict of Nantes was to England. She has the prudence to profit by it. Let us not discover less political sagacity. Afford to ingenuity and industry immediate and ample protection, and they will not fail to give a preference to this free and happy country. Sounds like Hamilton again. Mm-hmm. Yep. So there's the Calhoun of 1816, sounding very much like Alexander Hamilton, and saying you need to foster these domestic industries because in times of war, that's what it took for these people to get clubbed over the head enough to realize that, hey, Hamilton was right. And so you had the Monroe Consensus, basically, and John Quincy Adams coming out of the end of the Napoleonic War, the end of war of 1812 era. Mm-hmm. And this endured for a short time. But by 1828, the beginning of the Jackson administration, basically, he wasn't actually
sworn into office.
Sworn into office. What is it? Inaugurated? No.
Inaugurated?
Inaugurated. No, I'm saying it wrong.
Right, yeah, me too now.
What have I done?
Sworn in 1829?
It'd be March 1829 back then. So what between these two, what have you learned about Calhoun, though? Just to go on Calhoun.
What do you think about him?
Well, I think that there's kind of a like in that Calhoun found something that was working for him and he kept at it. And then when times were different, he switched in order to try to gain power in the other way. With being a Federalist, like a Hamiltonian, being part of the triumvirate with Webster and Clay, were clearly running the Congress at that point, as well as had solutions for the problems at the time. To later in his life in South Carolina and with Jackson, he was a free trade guy, and with disastrous results. Mm-hmm. But he was like a ship at sea. He was blown from wind to wind. And he happened to get some success and some name recognition with, going with the Hamiltonian system. Surprise.
Yeah.
And then he destroyed himself and his whole society by going with free trade and being a secessionist.
Yeah, it definitely got him by for the short term, right? I mean, back in the Saudi Arabia analogy, when you're practicing extraction economics, there's no future orientation for these people to really position themselves in a way that's going to best facilitate their long-term interests, right? Because a planter in the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, where they're not in the Mississippi Delta Valley region, which had more fertile soil, as we'll see. When your soil is being ran down every year, and you are basically Saudi Arabia, and your oil reserves or your soil quality is going down every year, and you're not investing anything with it through scientific agriculture, marling, as we'll see, or draining swamps or something like that, is that you don't care about something 5 years from now that's going to actually do a better return on you, because you might be living in a desert by then. Mm-hmm. You might have just utterly destroyed your soil anyway. So in that interim period, you're just paying more for buying the luxuries that you want from foreign manufacturers. People made the northern manufacturers in England and Paris or wherever else that are making these things for you. So that kind of short-termism is just cancer.
Yeah.
So there's a preliminary to the Exposition and Protest, December 19th, 1828. So maybe the name for this podcast will be Calhoun versus Calhoun.
Yeah.
It's just a complete about face. Although it is common to refer to the Exposition and Protest as the two parts of a single document, such is not the case. The Exposition, so this is a preface to it. the exposition is an essay enumerating South Carolina's grievances against the American system of protective tariffs and calling for constitutional safeguards to protect the states from abuse of federal power. The protest consists of the actual formal resolutions adopted by the General Assembly of South Carolina. Both appeared anonymously. So he wrote these articles vitriolically opposed to the American system and the tariff and published them anonymously.
Yeah, well, it's a really successful system. If you're going to attack it, you're going to get attacked back.
Yeah, if you're going to be a complete hypocrite, like within
a decade?
Yeah, a decade, just be total about-face of what you're saying. And, who's that other guy? I don't know. Now I'm the exact opposite of that person.
Yeah, well, when you are a slave to your ambition, it goes wherever it goes. If you need...
Like the wind.
Yeah, you can't be principled.
Yeah.
Because if you're principled, sometimes your ideas are going to be out of vogue.
Yeah, and then you're going to lose your power. So when it becomes, being principled or ambitious, unfortunately Calhoun chose the latter. So there's just wonderful excerpts in here. This is like worse than... it's just embarrassing how low quality the arguments are. The committee have bestowed on the subjects referred to them the deliberate attention which their importance demands. And the result, on full investigation, is unanimous opinion that the act of Congress of the last session, with its whole system of legislation imposing duties on imports, not for revenue, but the protection of one branch of industry at the expense of others, is unconstitutional, unequal, and oppressive.
Sounds like Brat.
Yeah. And calculated to corrupt the public virtue and destroy the liberty of the country, which propositions they propose to consider in the order stated, and then conclude the report with a consideration of the important question of the remedy. So, it sounds to me like the opponents of the Export-Import Bank, right? So,
yeah, absolutely.
Destroy free trade. And
crony capitalism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
While ignoring, the other side of that. You're going to get pork. You're going to get some corruption, but it's better corruption than the free trade corruption you're going to get. Corruption that helps, employ people is a part of doing business. You're never going to get
necessary evil.
Yeah.
Politics somehow ends like at the borders of the country. Like, what is the geopolitical situation? So if you don't have these things, what happens? There's other forces in the world. It's not just, you're not living on a moon colony where it's like the only thing that you have to do is your own polity and that's it. Like, in the absence of you doing something else is happening from some other power. Of course, at the time, even much more. People don't really understand this, right? Because we've lived in a unipolar world for the majority of people's lives, or in the entirety of a lot of people's lives listening to this. So don't imagine that there's other players in the world that actually have enough force to do something to affect your own life is really an alien concept. So that's why a lot of this stuff really gets a lot of traction in the modern context. They can dredge this stuff up. So these kind of arguments make even less sense than they did back then than as they do now, right? Like back then, the British were hegemonic. And so when you're pretending like they don't exist, it's, a very viceroy, centrapish, groveling kind of nature, You're saying like, oh, it's not try to get independence financially and economically from the greatest power in the world that's, over there in India right now, like expropriating the entire country and, soon to wage opium wars and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, to continue. The advocates of the tariff have offered no such proof. It is true that the third section of the first article of the Constitution authorizes Congress to lay and collect an impost duty, but it is granted as a tax power for the sole purpose of revenue. Oh, yeah. Where does it actually say that? A power in its nature essentially different from that of imposing protective or prohibitory duties. Their objects are incompatible. The prohibitory system must end in destroying the revenue from imports. So, just layers of crap.
So you're being fleeced by these import taxes for
aristocrats in Boston.
In Boston are for fleecing you.
Yeah.
Never mentioning, the growth of industry, the sort of Nile Delta of commerce that the Erie Canal is building up, the change to a market economy.
Yeah. and the factory systems, how the women and children at the time, with lack of opportunity, lack of education. Maybe you could have education also, but education wasn't as structured as it is now. And I would say there's a lot of improvements to the education back then of now. There's obviously pros and cons in both ways, but people are flocking into the industrial systems because it was an improvement of life. Like, you look at the rural Chinese peasant farmers and why they are flooding into the kind of sweatshop economies of the more industrialized parts of China. Because it's an improvement. And you're going from dirt poor poverty of subsistence farming to slave labor working. At least it's a prospectus of potential improvement, So, of course people are being forced off stuff, of course, that's all happening too, right? But, anyway. Okay, so...
But they can't make, economic arguments.
It's all, mass.
It's all sort of constitutional, parliamentary, this clause doesn't say you can do this, while you have this great benefit that's applying to your society.
Yeah, and what was the constitutionality for the embargo? That was super iron-fisted compared to a tariff. You're saying we're going to cut off all trade and have a great wall, in effect, of no interaction with other people. Of course, it's during the Napoleonic Wars and all that, so there's all that layer of it going on. But still, just the whole constitutionality and power of the government argument makes no sense. The prohibitory system must end in destroying the revenue from imports. So it's saying if you tax anything as a import tax, tariff, you're actually going to destroy all imports. Just okay, if you say so, no proof. That's actually totally backwards. Actually, in all the areas of protection, you have more industries, you have raising wages. So the people that have raised wages and improve living standards and labor conditions can buy more, and so you're growing your domestic economy, so you actually have more trade, even though it's taxed, but whatever. It has been said that the system is a violation of the spirit and not the letter of the Constitution. The distinction is not material. I think that's actually quite material, don't you think? So something's a violation of the letter or spirit of something. Isn't that material issue?
Absolutely say so.
That's something for the Supreme Court to decide. But if it's an issue of letter or spirit, that's very, very substantive to a legal argument. The Constitution grants to Congress the power of imposing a duty on imports for revenue, which power is abused by being converted into an instrument for rearing up of industry of one section of the country and the ruins of another. Zero-sum game. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But if someone else is doing good, it's because someone else is doing poorly. This is the mindset of extraction economics, though. It's the mindset of the planter class, right? Because the whole model of the planter class was this. If you are doing well, you're extracting the soil. If you're selling good crops. If there's a lot of if the yield of the crop, if you had a lot of good rain that season, then the crop was bountiful, but then the price was low because there's so much flooding the market of cotton or tobacco that it lowered the price, right? So everything was very zero sum with this. Imagine the oil economy. It is very zero sum, right?
Yeah. If someone's importing someone else's oil,
sure, lower your price.
Absolutely.
So, this is how they think. The Constitution grants to Congress. Okay, already read that. So Constitution. The only safe rule is the Constitution itself. Like Ron Paul arguments here. Very constitutional, except all the parts that they don't like or the parts that they aren't referencing. Or
it's you can see the arguments from Calhoun that their mirrors are today, like the Dave Bratt stuff. This could be straight from his speeches on the anti-import-export bank.
Yeah, totally.
Regurgitated.
Nothing changes, It was moved, so anyway, they're talking about the convention and all this. It was moved in that body to confer on Congress, they're talking about the Constitutional Convention. It was moved in that body to confer on Congress the very power in question to encourage manufactures, but it was deliberately withheld, except to the extent of granting patent rights for new and useful inventions. Instead, it's like all the stuff that came up with them talking about Hamilton wanted a king and all this stuff. You're in a deliberation to found a country and create a new constitution. So there's going to be all kinds of arguments and misconceptions of arguments and things, and they're just dredging, oh, this person said this at this convention. It didn't make it into the final document, but somehow it's still relevant. So, like, what are you for, Calvin? Are you for the Constitution or not? Because you're saying, oh, Constitution, 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 but at the Constitutional Convention you had all these arguments that didn't make it into the actual document, but yet some of those are equally as valid as the Constitution. What?
Yeah, it's just
total hypocrisy. But, in the same paragraph, right? Because they think you're stupid enough not to put two and two together. And same with Dave Brad, just idiotic level demagogy. Instead of granting the power, permission was given to the states to impose duties with the consent to Congress to encourage their own manufacturers, and thus, in the true spirit of justice, imposing the burden on those who are to be benefited. So he's saying that, like, individual states can somehow pass tariffs, even though that's totally illegal.
Yeah, you don't want to do
that. You can't do that.
Yeah.
It's unconstitutional itself. And so, having all these small fiefdoms start to, like, guard against international trade.
Yeah, we tried that.
A country is, that was the 1780s. It was a total disaster. So a country is a free trade zone. And you can have free trade within a country to the extent of, like, when I'm talking about trade, not free markets in the real abstract sense of things, is because everyone's playing by the same rules, or should be. And the violations of that come out of people not playing by the same rules. Uneven playing fields, monopolies, cartels, lobbying, insider deals, that kind of stuff, right? But that's the closest thing you can get to an actual free market, is like within a nation itself. So he's saying, from the write-up he did in 1816, it's saying, like, our biggest problem at the tail end of that argument, I didn't read it, but he said, our biggest problem is disunion and the risk of disunion. Now he's saying every state should have its own tariff. What could be more disunion than that? That's like just inviting feudalism and the total dissolution of the country.
Yeah, to the benefit of a very few. That, at least they think it's their benefit in the short term.
Yeah, and you can see the mindset of these people, how it would lead to a civil war, right? Because it's all very short-termism, right? So they can't think of any way out of the problem or any way to, like, work on long-term solutions. It's all just very short-sighted. The manufacturing states, even in their own opinion, bear no share of the burden of the tariff in reality. We may infer with the greatest certainty of their conduct. The fact that they urgently demand an increase and consider every addition as a blessing, and the failure to obtain one as a curse, is the strongest confession that whatever burden it imposes, in reality falls not on them, but on others. Men ask not for burdens, but benefits. The tax paid by the duties on imports, by which, with the exception of the receipts from the sale of the public lands, and a few incidental terms, the government is wholly supported, and which, in the gross amount annually, equals $23 million. Anyway, talking about how the whole government is supported by the tariff, is then, in truth, no tax on them. Whatever portion of it they advance as consumers of the articles on which it is imposed, returns to them with usurious interest through an artfully contrived system. That such are the facts, the committee will proceed to demonstrate, by other arguments, besides the confession of all the parties interested in these acts. So the ultimate argument is saying is that the South pays the import, the tariff, and that the North actually doesn't pay the tariff. And so therefore this is all an artful tax on the South. Because somehow the Southerners can't buy articles from the North, in which they would pay no tax.
But they're more expensive because they're not because there's not as developed economies as the ones they would get from, like, Great Britain.
Well, and they have the principle of being marginally, medianly more high, but that is because the cartels and monopolies in Britain are practicing dumping constantly. So, like, we'll follow with Kerry later that like how much it cost for like a pound of pig iron or something like that was like $4 one year and then $12 the next, or $12 then $4, right? So you have this wild bubble economic system, and plus also with the Bank of England being able to manipulate the prime rate and the capital inflows and outflows. Like, imagine quantitative easing, right, where they lower the bank rate here, all the money flees to abroad, goes and fluffs up all these abroad economies, inflating their currencies, And then when that leaves, it causes this massive, painful deflation and blows out all their little domestic economies that can be destroyed with like a few $1 billion, So this is what's going on in this time, right? So the South doesn't care that, I can reliably buy these articles for $7 because right now I can buy them for $3, even though next year it's going to be $12 because of the boom-bust cycle. It's all just this, gambling race for expedient return. Anyway, he continues. The burden of the tariff almost falls on them exclusively, referring to the South. It is only a necessity to show that, as far as their interest is concerned, there is little or no difference between an export or an import duty. So he's saying, you might as well just tax our exports, because that's the same thing as taxing manufactured imports.
What?
It seems quite different to me.
Yeah.
It's like nothing the same at all. So he's trying to create a equation here that like A equals B equals C, and saying that since A, the import tariff on manufactured goods, equals B, a tax on the South, that C, you should just tax the South directly, because then obviously it'll be so unpopular. And it won't even actually encourage manufacturers. Because people in the North will be able to buy manufacturers abroad at no interest. It's just complete sophistry. It just makes no sense. But he's like trying to draw these false equivalencies. So anyway, we have from Soil and Climate a faculty in rearing certain great agricultural staples, while other older countries with dense population and capital greatly accumulated have equal facility in manufacturing various articles suited to our use. And thus a foundation is laid for an exchange of the products of labor mutually advantageous. Sounds like Ricardo. All right, competitive advantage, right? All that stuff. The whole Ricardian doctrine, the Smith population growth theorem of like, these areas have high population, so therefore we have to buy from them because we can't have high population. Oh, why is that? Oh, because we won't have a tariff that actually builds up these industrial facilities to make the cities more dense. So he's saying that in reality, all taxes are paid by the producer of the articles exchanged, which is also pretty great because in the new modern reactionary context, it's always the consumer pays everything. Right. And this is how they do it, right? So Calhoun is against the tariff for obviously very political reasons, economic reasons. Yet, like Milton Friedman later in something else maybe we'll cover in some distant future, Milton Friedman says, okay, these things are bad, so therefore I'm for this, which will supposedly solve these problems that I'm illustrating. There's actually like just way worse in every regard. It's a sabotage method. It's like a poison pill method of politics, right? They're saying, I'm trying to solve this problem, and you're creating something way worse because you know it's going to create a backlash and it's going to be politically impossible to further. And also why this article was published anonymously. When he's writing anonymously and not attaching his name to this, it's very clear that this is very, very disingenuous writing.
Just wrong, and just going to be, used in the future to show what a duplicitous, incompetent disaster mongerer this guy is.
Yeah. In the New York Times compendium of recovering the Civil War, they specifically point out during the onset of the war, they're like, all these people are, grew up with Calhounisms and like their heads filled with Calhounian ideology, and why that this got to this point. And so this is one of the main principal ideologues of founding this ridiculous basis for Southern independence, and all the hundreds of thousands that died in the disaster that was failed Reconstruction, and just setting the whole trajectory for the complete tragedy of the continuing backwardness of the South.
Yeah.
And having the slaves emancipated in the way was not the optimal way to get rid of slavery. It was a system of gradual emancipation. Just follow the Russian model. What Russia did. We'll follow that later. But
yeah, with what is it, Alexander II?
Yeah, I think so. I got a couple books on him that we're going to touch on to see models of emancipation and like what would have been a suitable way to go.
Mm-hmm. And also, you can compare this sort of ideological poison to like libertarianism right now. Just the apocalyptic nature of these ideas. Just no future involved, no solutions, no practical, end the Fed, Destroy, burn it down, it'll be better.
It's just very short, just myopic. Like they only can think about tomorrow, but not the next day. To continue here. It is true that a tax on the imports by raising the price of the articles imported may in time produce the supply at home, and thus give a new direction to the exchanges of the country. But it is also true that a tax on exports, by diminishing at home the price of the same material, may have the same effect, and with no greater burden to the grower.
No, because then you can't trade.
Yeah, it's saying basically the old model that they did with Ireland, that the British imposed on Ireland, of you could only send your woolen exports to us. So you basically just blow out the market there, and there become a completely subservient market to the English manufacturers.
Yeah, sharecropper.
Yeah, and your commodity price cannot rise with the growing industrial capacity.
You don't have access.
Yeah, you don't have access to the other markets. So just complete sabotage. Like this person is actively engaged in trying to sabotage the body politic through these fake solutions. Just totally disgusting. But of course, by this time, late 1820s in South Carolina, this is completely dominated by the slave class. Utterly dominated by the slave class. So he's just singing that tune, That all these people are just representatives for much greater tectonic economic forces that are going on underneath the scenes. Whether the situation of the South will be materially benefited by this new direction given to its exchanges will be considered hereafter, but whatever portion of our foreign exchanges may, in fact, remain in any stage of this process, exchanging market, blah, 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 just trying to make some kind of, just trying to make that false equivalency. Whatever duty may be imposed to bring it about must fall on the foreign trade which remains and be paid by the South almost exclusively, as much so as an equal amount on the duty of their exports. So just saying, once again, the South is the only one actually paying the tariff, which is utterly false. Anyone who buying anything goes to a customs house. The North pays it as well. The South pays it. The difference is you can buy domestic.
Much easier in the North than you can buy it in the South because the South has no, industrial economy base.
Yeah, no. This is also kind of like what John Quincy Adams would do in trying to unify the South and building much more nationally oriented internal improvements and roads, is to connect the commerce of the North and South to much greater degree. Because think about the shipping technology of the day. Minus a railroad, if you live in Charleston or something like that, you live somewhat near the coast, river accessible areas of
you can
the
get
deep South.
steamships.
Yeah, even before the steamship too, though, or like as that was coming online, without the right canal systems, the rivers are unnavigable. You couldn't.
Yeah, how would you get canals? So you'd have to build them.
In real sense, logistically, England was closer than like a state 2 or 3 states away from you. Like a land route of 800 miles was much further distance than 1,000, 2,000 miles across the ocean, or whatever it is. So because you could drive that like in the old colonial time, like the Mississippi river system was closer to England than it was to the New England colonies in a way, because obviously the sea routes are much quicker. So that all going on. So he makes this brilliant argument that really reminds me of the modern arguments you'll hear from some reactionaries that the red states actually are the ones that pay all the federal tax revenue.
Okay.
And the blue states are the ones that actually are all the welfare queens.
Yeah, that is something you hear.
So it's all the the powerhouse economics of Walmart and other such extraction systems. It's just like that thing we read earlier on the Economist, right? The low regulation, low capital intensity, low wage systems are really actually the best systems and the most desirable from the position of the economist, and that the worst ones are actually where all the high-tech industry manufacturing is going on. Washington, California. So anyway, he's the same kind of comparison. They're saying the exports of domestic produce in round numbers may be estimated averaging at 59 or 53 million annually. The states growing cotton and tobacco produced 37 million. In the last 4 years, the average amount of the export of cotton, rice, tobacco exceeded 35 million, to which if we add flour and other stuff, anyway, considerably more than, he did run some math, very limited math, just looking at foreign exchange, and just looking at what the South pays. So just selectively plucking certain statistics to make his point. You read Henry Carey, that guy fills whole pages with statistical graphs and charts and matrices.
Yeah.
Of showing he's a statistician. He's just showing all this stuff, and the domestic economy is most important. You're try to gauge any economy based on foreign exchange. Once again, the Saudi Arabia model comes to the forefront. Look at Saudi Arabia's international exchange; it's huge. It's a majority of its domestic economy. Its GDP is but a little bump on top of its foreign exchange. Look at a country that has a large GDP, and the foreign exchange is always a small percentage of that. So once again, the total incompatibility of the North and South economies again. I'm just, not even North and South economies, just a modern economy versus a backward economy.
Yeah, and Calhoun's attempt to further exasperate these things. It doesn't have to be that way.
I like this. Without the qualification, no proposition could be more fallacious than the consumer's pay. So he's saying if you have a consumption tax, a foreign consumption tax, a tariff, that the consumer is actually not paying that.
Huh?
You just scratch your head, you're what? So if you pay a sales tax, you're not actually paying that. If you pay a sales tax, what a tariff is a sales tax on foreign goods. And you do that because you want to foster. It's not the direct action of collecting that tax revenue is important. It's what is caused by the effect of that. And the company that I deal with, that I work with in my own professional life, we were selling things to Brazil, and if you wanted to, we were attaching some personal computers on top of the order that they wanted, and because if they buy personal computers from foreign manufacturers, they have to pay a 75% tariff. And why is that? Well, when they create a system, when Brazil says if you're going to buy a foreign computer that's manufactured in a foreign country, we're going to charge you a 75% tariff, it's because HP and Lenovo and IBM or Dell are I'm immediately going to build a factory in your country because it's large enough and has enough of a demand for these products that if they manufacture them there, they don't have to pay that tariff. Mm-hmm. And then the difference is, then you have domestic power over your domestic manufacturers. And now you have a capacity to produce what you want, which is sovereignty, it's freedom, it's independence, autonomy, right? You can't do that if you're relying on some kind of foreign manufacturer.
Absolutely.
So the same thing here. So it's this rigmarole nonsense of, without qualification, no proposition could be more fallacious than the consumers pay consumption taxes. I don't even know it's really worth going into the rest of this because it's just equally as hilarious. He's calling himself in the Southern class, we are the serfs of this system.
Of course. We
are the victims, out of whose the labor is raised. Not only the money is paid to our money is paid to the treasury, but the funds of which we are drawn from the rich rewards of the manufacturer. Okay, so right, we're the victims, of course. And of course, the assumption of this is the South. He's couching all this, and it is in the South and the North. It is this very increase of price which may be paid by their fellow citizens of the South that their industry is affected. The South, the South, the South, the South. No, it's the Southern slave oligarch class. Other parts of the South would love to have manufacturers, but they can't do it.
Yeah, they'd love to have a real economy in this, Georgia, Mississippi.
But
the planter elite, no way.
Yeah, they don't want that kind of thing around. They don't even want that stuff existing in New England, much less in their backyard. They're totally content to have it overseas, where it can be bought at the cheapest price, and provide, and of course provide no counterweight and grow up to challenge their authority. He says their encouragement, referring to the manufacturers, is our discouragement. Wonderful, zero sum game again. The duty on imports, which is mainly paid out from our labor. I like that. I like a slave oligarch referring to their labor.
Yeah,
that's
got to.
That's
really they have this yeoman farmer noble, the Cincinnatus sort of view of they have to cultivate of themselves.
Yeah, well, appealing to the underclass that exists there that's really pissed off at the backwardness of the system, right?
Mm-hmm. And they're the ones that are really paying for the...
And they're going to pay for it with their lives in the Civil War, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the duty on imports, which is mainly paid out of our labor, gives them the means of selling to us at a higher price, while we cannot, to compensate the loss, dispose of our products at the least advance. It is then indeed not a subject of wonder when understood that our section of the country, though helped by a kind providence with a genial sun and prolific soil, from which spring the richest products, should languish in poverty and sink into decay, while the rest of the Union, though less fortunate in natural advantages, are flourishing in unexampled prosperity. So he's blaming the entirety of the backwardness of the South on the North.
Of course, scapegoat, build the other.
Yeah.
You got to do. These are all things that, if someone's a warmonger, they have to build. You've got to build the other. You need a scapegoat. Why are you poor? It's because of the North. It's not my planter elite friends that I'm desperately tap dancing for in order to get some appointment.
Yeah, it's just totally cynical. So it's just imagine the modern Republicans blaming everything on immigration.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. These are the Tea Party Republicans foremost that are much more like your sort of Southern fire eaters or copperheads than the country club class that wants the cheap labor.
Yeah, and then Dave Bratt even being more the archetype for this, even being more genial to just the raw predatory nature of finance capital, right? So we want no defense to anything, and so making it even worse, just getting the same in through different means, and the means look populist, racist,
social.
Populist,
cultural populist
to the whites that are really angry and ignorant and don't know what's going on. The assertion that the encouragement of industry of the manufacturing states is in fact discouragement to ours was not made without due deliberation. It is suspectful of the clearest proof. We cultivate certain great staples for the supply of the general market of the world. They manufacture almost exclusively for the home market. So, we're better because we cultivate certain great staples for the supply of the general market of the world, while they almost exclusively for the home market, right? Yeah, so you exchange for foreign sweatshop slaves in London and areas of really crushed industrial parts of French Europe areas. Yeah, it's just
like the factories in Les Mis, those textile mills in France get southern slave cotton.
Just totally self-serving and sounding like so grandiose, right? We make through slavery we sell these things to the markets of the world, and they're only about the domestic market. The thing is, anything with the domestic market is going to be orders of magnitude larger than what you can export. It's always been the case. Any industrial society, the GDP is way larger, and the foreign exchange is a mere proportion of the GDP. Mm-hmm. With extraction economies, it's the opposite. And you don't want that, because it only serves the razor-thin oligarchs at the expense of everyone else, because they can't develop and they can't pursue technology and industry. Their object in the tariff is to keep down foreign competition in order to obtain a monopoly of the domestic market. So they want to rely on a foreign monopoly, basically. The Southern class is like, we're content to be relying on the foreign monopoly. They want to establish a domestic monopoly, even though having competition between foreign and abroad and such a large contention against the tariff actually would provide a facsimile of a system of fair competition. But that's all a statesman too far.
You're not going to get that out of this.
These reactionary fire breathers. Yeah. Anyway, we're being made to be bought at a higher price and having to sell other things at a lower price. And then he makes some really crude mathematics, totally arithmetic. That if you've had one class in economics, if you ever heard the term elasticity, you can't just do arithmetic to talk about macroeconomics, but just algebraic level equations is totally retarded. So, and then in total hypocrisy, on the same page, if we can now, with an increased price in the tariff, contend with success under a reduction of 45% in the prices of our products, we could drive out all competition, and thus add annually to the consumption of all our cotton 300 or 400 bales. So that's kind of a floating excerpt in a much larger paragraph. But he's condemning them for wanting to establish a domestic monopoly, and then later in the exact same goddamn paragraph, he's saying that if we didn't have this tariff to contend with, we could drive all other foreign competitors of the cotton market out of business.
Yeah.
So just utter hypocrisy. They're trying to have a tariff so they can establish a domestic monopoly, but in the absence of this, we can establish a domestic monopoly. We can establish an international monopoly of the cotton market.
Yeah.
And no sense of shame or hypocrisy in saying that.
Well, I mean, he doesn't put his name on it, so
Yeah.
there's certainly some shame there.
Totally just ridiculous. And then it goes on and on. It has like another 20 pages. I'm not going to bother reading. No more agony of that. Just... That's halfway through it, is, we only suffer in the South economically because the North is extracting us. Even though later they would totally abolish the tariffs and the South would just continue to sink into more poverty and misery. Mm-hmm. Obviously that argument has no bearing at all. And then, it's all extracting us. Actually, we in the South are the big economy because we're the ones producing everything in the soils, and there's no... totally disregarding all the farming going on in Massachusetts and all those areas, which is incredibly much more productive. It's just the hypocrisy. And, of course, they want to establish a monopoly, even though they don't. They would just want to establish actually domestic sovereignty and enough clout to resist the predations of foreign monopolies. And then we want to establish a monopoly, but that's not somehow hypocritical. And it just goes on, right? So when you're dealing with that level of hypocrisy and unfairness and schizophrenic nature of not even being able to confront reality, and that's already in 1828. I mean, you can imagine the kind of permutations and layers of nonsense and bullshit that's going to be built on that over the next 30 years in the run to the Civil War. That's how bad it is. The level of dialogue.
As the problems exasperate.
Yeah, as the economic problems get worse. Yeah,
as the standard of living for the average Southern yeoman farmer continue to deteriorate. The rhetoric ramps up more and more. You get your myth of the other in there because if I'm doing poorly, the North is the reason why.
Yeah.
Then you get this catastrophe of the Civil War.
Yeah. It really makes me cringe though when people say the war wasn't caused by slavery. It's like, wow.
Yeah, I don't see that very much anymore.
It's pretty indefensible. That was like the old,
lost cause,
resurgent kind of reactionary Reaganism. Back in the forefront. The old, basically the political cycle we've been living through for all of our lives. This resurgent reactionaryism. So that's Calhoun. There's not much more worth saying about the guy.
Well, he was really influential in how people he was successful.
Yeah.
In his demagogy.
Oh yeah.
Got him, up in society, and so he was emulated by a lot of people, such as James Henry Hammond, who takes this sort of hypocrisy and just continues it with disastrous results.
Yeah, and he's a really ambitious person, even talking to Calhoun in this era, and you can see how Calhoun's dragged in this direction because of the fundamental underlying realities of the economic system. Right? Mm-hmm.
So I would see John C. Calhoun as like a Ron Paul. That was
pretty fair comparison. All the arguments sound very much like Ron Paul.
And he's being emulated by a lot of people because he had success into, sort of your Ted Cruz's now. Could be like a Henry Hammond or god-awful Tea Party reactionaries. Like there was this guy that lost in Mississippi recently who barely...
Against Thad.
Yeah.
Cochrane.
Yeah, and this rise of Calvinists. We need to talk about that, too. These Calvinists, these neo-Calvinists. I just finished All the King's Men, and that has a lot of Calvinists in them. Man is conceived in sin and born in corruption. It's Calvinists. Like the main doctrine of Calvinism.
Yeah, that's great.
That's what you're dealing with, this sort of... That's why they have all these apocalyptic overtones to everything that of their entire philosophy.
Or the kind of churches I was dragged to as a kid was very... the world is corrupt and totally fallen, and it's just, very bleak. It's like,
just walk on this razor-thin path to salvation.
And the only the good thing you can hope for is an afterlife. That there's nothing worth pursuing in the modern world that's worth a damn. And that is just a total cancerous. It's a mind fuck. It's like a mental disease of how people
think about things.
As Machiavelli would say, the greatest crime of the Christian church is focusing on the afterlife instead of improving the one that they're in.
Yeah. That's why they still get the opprobrium of all the various political factions from Machiavelli. Caring about the actual world? Hell, I dominate that. That's my extraction mechanism so I can live this fantastic life of hubris. So anyone challenging that, you're my enemy. Signed, the oligarchy. Yeah, I mean, that's a thing too, right? So Ron Paul concocts a really deceptive angle in which to kind of have this dialogue with the zeitgeist of the population.
Yeah.
And then that language is that's effective, that's effective demagogy. So there's other opportunistic people, get prominence. They're speaking to something about the social condition of the total mindset of the population, or classes, sections, culture, subculture groups within it. And when that is operating on such a low level of education and comprehension and wisdom, that these things get traction, it's just really bad. Right?
Yeah, it's a lack of historical knowledge. I mean, anyone trade tariff is such a it's such a positive track record that you can't really. There's no really argument against it.
Yeah.
And so you have to just not talk about it ever and just say free trade, free trade, free trade forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, it's just the Calhoun argument. You have to go into these just tailspins of logic to concoct some kind of reason to be against it. There's really no basis in reality of political economy to be against it. But that really shows that just education and becoming more knowledgeable yourself about these things is the solution.
Yeah.
Because the zeitgeist of the population is so degenerated and so corrupt and stupid that there's no way that anything can take shape in a landscape in which all these people are entertaining these just absurd notions of everything. It's just totally hopeless.
They seem to be able to diagnose problems like the people I was talking to at the bookshop. They had the problems correctly diagnosed, a lot of them, but they didn't have any solutions, and then they ran away before they could even talk about stuff. And when I said trade tariff, the guy looked at me like, oh wait, that exists. Yeah, that would be a helpful thing.
A baby knows when it's hungry, and so that's the first step of analysis, right? That this system we live in sucks. This isn't worthy of human life, so the next step, of course, is learning how to cook or something like that, or how to grow food. It's a whole different science that has to be, and the problem with a lot of the utopian-minded people, they think they can just say, I'm hungry, and just they say it louder and more furiously that somehow someone's going to come around and feed them.
Yeah, like anarchists.
Yeah.
Just
they should just actually go out there dressed like babies and just cry, because effectively that's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
They're not showing any capacity to govern.
Yeah, and the problems we have now can be solved with some really practical, tools. Public credit is not radical. The trade tariff of 15% is not radical.
Yeah.
These are things that are common sense solutions that have been done before with great results. And so, when you come across arguments or people talking about, things are all so messed up and, we don't have a healthcare system, well, but you can pay for that with a 1% Wall Street sales tax and all trades of $1 million or more.
Yeah.
Bam.
Wham bam.
And so it's really important to have these solutions ready.
Also, just on the level of comprehension, if you get someone repeating just those talking points that way,
mm-hmm.
without understanding a more in-depth knowledge of what's underlying economics, different economic systems, I like to draw this distinction over and over again of economics of extraction or actual production, elevation, improving humanity, industrial capitalism, basically, as facilitated by the state, encouraging it because there's no other way to do it.
But not state run. You wouldn't want that.
Right. Like what is and just knowing
there's a middle ground.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Could you get the creativity and innovation of the market?
That's a good point to make. That people need to know where these distinctions are, so they can have an argument, so they can comprehend where these lines are and all this stuff. So just elevating the political dialogue is just essential to getting out of these problems. I remember being back at Occupy. It was just a disaster. And it was just like every person with this utopian-minded, idealistic, the Howard Zinn people and the Zeitgeist people and the Ron Paulites and the anarchists and the Black Bloc anarchists and just the people with the poli-sci, political science degrees, and just all is just, oh my God, like
identity politics.
Yeah, right, all this stuff. That'd be a really good. It's a good thing to focus on. Like, what is the legitimate role of the market, quote unquote, or just finance capital in general?
I think.
And what is the role of the state?
I think that companies should be like race cars, really specifically designed things to do a machine designed to do one thing, and that's the job that they have to do. Like the fact that companies are involved in healthcare, providing that, I think is crazy. It's a huge burden on a company that I build planes. If I'm Boeing, no, I just want to do this. Why can't? It's a whole other department, and I just think it's wasteful, and that's why there needs to be a public plan, a real healthcare system.
Yeah, and something I see is that basically when you have an economy or a sphere of economics that becomes so well-known, shop-worn, that nothing really innovative or creative is going on with it, or it is just best facilitated by the state, or it is naturally a monopoly in and of itself, and therefore should not be dictated to, quote-unquote, finance, the market or finance capital interests in developing a return, then those are areas that are best suited by the state. So, you don't want utility companies to be privatized.
No, you don't.
Because it's a monopoly. It's a natural monopoly. And so you have no competition. So the only thing they can do to increase their own profits is to
raise rates,
cut
services,
expenditures.
Yeah.
So it's basically let the infrastructure wither and collapse as we extract the maximum amount of value out of it as we possibly can. That's what happens, right? So all utilities should not be ran by private spheres of influence. But on the other side of that, you don't want anything with investment, like the major investment banks right now, like on Silicon Valley, determining what the next biggest thing is going to be. That's the perfect role for Wall Street and the financiers and stuff like that to do. And that's where all the risk is. So let them go take the risk,
That's what they're there for.
You want to push them into the positions of risk-reward. Where there's no risk-reward mechanism, they shouldn't be there, because that's not economics of production, it's economics of extraction.
Yeah, BlackRock wants to buy up, the gas utility companies, and they certainly don't want to...
Northwest Natural.
Yeah.
All that.
Oh, I'm using that as an example, because it's a natural monopoly, and they certainly don't want to, invest in startups.
Yeah, that's risky.
That's risky.
Who am I going to give my money to someone? What if their idea fails? Then I lose my money. It's that's the market you claim to love so much. Go make love with it.
Yeah. Instead, they're trying. So.
But I'm going to go finagle with this monopoly thing. I really like what it's got going on. I'm going to leave this entrepreneurial love affair that I claim to have, but really actually don't like at all. Why does Comcast suck so much? Why are they such a horrible company? Have an F rating? Because it's a monopoly. It's a natural monopoly. Yeah. You're not going to have competition in this area. So they need to be owned by the state or regulated so much that they can't abuse any of the power they have. This is better ran by a state thing.
Yeah.
Like that thing that was circulating showing that the only...
Well, I think a fast internet connection is a national interest. I think that's pretty common sense that the more people you have connected to high-speed internet, the more economic production you're going to have, the better educated population, and all the benefits that we've already seen coming with the internet can just be put some, more gasoline on that fire.
Yeah. and the compounded misinterest that exists from Comcast of not only being a monopoly but also a media company. So then it has a natural animus against people getting on the new media because it owns old dinosaur media that it wants to maintain. And it's just proven that if people have access to high-speed internet, they're going to rely less on TV, less on cable television.
Yeah, I don't know any young people that have TV.
Yeah. Yeah, there's recent statistics showing that like CNN's and Fox News' average viewing audience is like in their 70s.
Yeah, let's talk about the Dan Carlin podcast for a bit. Dan Carlin did this podcast with Cenk Unger from the Young Turks, and this is a real problem of historical knowledge that I think Cenk Unger ran up against when he condemned the Export-Import Bank.
Yeah, calling it, he said, the Republicans in a rare moment of principled activity were against the Import-Import Bank. It's like, Cenk, are you fucking kidding me? Like, after your whole career, you're going to say that the Republicans are going to have any moment of principled anything? Are you kidding me?
When you're dealing with government, you can all... This is an argument that's well-worn, this crony capitalism. And you can say it, and it's certainly valid in the relationship between Wall Street and the government. But crony capitalism that has a net benefit to the society is something you want to cultivate because you want a closer relationship with these large industrial producers because you want the population that works in them to be treated the best way possible. In doing so, giving a good relationship with the government is a way to ensure that.
And ultimately, they create
wealth. They create wealth and value, and you want to magnify that.
They create prosperity
as much as possible.
Goldman Sachs creates nothing. They're like a giant parasite. So, big difference.
But not having the historical context to understand that there's a difference, because you can just see bank and go, "Rah, bank, burn it down." Mm-hmm. I think that's a major issue. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this. So that you can understand that there are nuances and absolutism is very rarely.
Definitely. That's the problem with Cenk, though, is he's just, this and that. He doesn't seem that well educated to me, or like that. He never says anything that profoundly, interesting.
Yeah, but just being a progressive is so much better than anything else that's out there. That he just gets all this, credibility.
Yeah, and I have a lot of sympathy for Cenk and like what he does in general, but it just goes to show like this lack of historical understanding is just killing us.
Yeah,
it's just slaughtering us.
Because if he would have came out and said, I think it's a good thing to promote, American industry on foreign markets,
right,
with cheaper insurance that you get from the Export-Import Bank.
It makes the taxpayer money. Yeah. That's what I can't understand. This should be just night and day. It makes the taxpayer money, period. Like now, if you're making taxpayer money off of student loans, this thing that Elizabeth Warren's running around with, but it's a different issue. But, there's still, that money would have been made by Goldman Sachs. So, I guess in that sense, it's better. Just if you're going to say, like, we're going to abolish this, then what? There's always a then what. And, like, unless you can answer that then what, then you aren't actually helping anything. Because a lot of times the consequences of something are much worse than the actual thing you had. And so you have to be willing to understand causality.
Yeah, it makes me think of sort of like some of the Rousseauian thinkers before in the pre-French Revolution stuff. Yeah. Destroy this, and then...
Utopia.
Yeah. Blank, then profit.
Sounds like Calhoun, yeah.
It's Underpants Gnomes thinking.
It's Calhoun. Everything that we have, we're being totally extracted. We're providing, surplus produce to the markets of the world, and we're paying all the federal taxes. So these aristocrats in New England can parasitize us. Same kind of thing, right? Destroy the tariff, and everything will be beautiful. Oh, they destroyed the tariff. Actually, everything was way worse, and the economy was in a total depression. Oh, well, Civil War. That's our next solution. They're somehow still manipulating us, so we got to part ways. So, what do you think? Yeah?
Sure.
Yeah. So we're going to, what's this guy's name again?
David Blight.
David Blight. He's a professor at Yale, and he still has a really great series on the whole lead up to the Civil War and Reconstruction. Mm-hmm. On YouTube you can watch by David Blight.
You can also use it as a podcast from iTunes.
Oh,
It's
cool.
on there as well.
Yeah, it's 27 parts. Each of them is about
45 minutes.
really great material. So we're going to use some excerpts I selected out of that.
And both sides, both North and South, in their political leadership, in their economic leadership, were led by hard-boiled, believing, practicing capitalists. Southern slaveholders were not pre-capitalist. There's historical scholarship that used to argue that a couple generations ago, but not anymore. And throw this statistic up. You could argue that both sides had essentially the same kind of oligarchies. Less than 1% of the real and personal property in both South and North by the 1850s was held by approximately 50% of free adult males. The richest 1% in both sections, put another way, held 27% of all the wealth. The richest 1% in both sections, put another way, held 27% of all the wealth. The North had budding oligarchies, just like the South did. Now, those oligarchies were based on different things. And that's where the rub came. If I could hang your hat on one kind of Southern distinctiveness, perhaps above all, it's fun to play with all these stereotypes and realize that if so many people were writing this way from personal observation, yeah, there must be something to all these differences. But what eventually evolved in the South, and we will return to this a good deal next Tuesday when I'll devote an entire lecture to this kind of slaveholder worldview and the pro-slavery argument, the pro-slavery defense, and how that evolved into a political culture. But if there's one thing, and this is a little risky because there are always holes in any claim like this, but if there's one distinct feature of the Old South society and indeed its leadership and most of its people, it would be what we might label anti-modernism.
Yeah, it reminds you of anything? So the anti-modern slave owners and sort of planter elite, and then you have your reactionary Republicans, anti-modern, Hobby Lobby.
Yeah, we want to go back to the 1850s, 1860s, before the Civil Rights Act.
It was a society that eventually developed a disdain for what they perceived as the corruptions of modern commercialism. Southern slaveholding leadership in particular were very suspicious of the spread of literacy.
Not a good sign. When your ruling class is against literacy, that is pretty backward, I got to tell you. And this is only, people can remember this is only 150 years ago.
Of literacy. They were very suspicious of the democratic tendencies, or so it seemed, the democratic tendencies of that northern society, which was spreading literacy more widely, and eventually the right to vote more widely, at least among white people. It is a society where the leadership, for sure, and much of the non-leadership, were suspicious of reform, suspicious of change, suspicious of democracy itself. Democracy, the slaveholding class of the South came to see small d as a dangerous thing. It was a threat to hierarchy, and the South became, quite distinctively, a very hierarchical society. More on that in just a second. It became a hierarchical society rooted very deeply in open conceptions of class and obviously open conceptions of race. Some were born to rule. In the overall attitude of the planter class and the leadership class of the American South by the 1840s and 1850s, some were born to rule and some born to be ruled. Deal with it, was their attitude. They became deeply protective and insistent upon their own peculiar sense, and there's a great scholarship on this, their own peculiar sense of honor. honor. That old-fashioned concept, it's an old-fashioned word. How many of you even use that word anymore?
Honor basically translates to respect my privilege.
Yeah, dueling, and you have that sort of heightened sense of personal honor that you get in the South, and all these times, like there was this story in Henry Hammond about these two South Carolinian students that got in a duel over a buffet line,
reaching for like a thing that both of them wanted,
and they could not, because their sense of personal honor was so inflated due to this ridiculous culture that they're in, that they shot each other, and they had both died of infection, like on the Oregon Trail.
Right, so this is the cultivation of this is going on in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s.
Well, they have to do this because they need to feel good about themselves in some way, because they know, if you can see how they talk about slavery, is they use these washed terms and can never really describe what it is. I mean, some people can, but very few, and not really in the culture. They have this sort of heightened sense of honor, personal honor. It's so important.
Yeah, and when you're in an economic system, fundamentally, when you can only advance by stepping on the backs of others,
yeah,
then you're going to create this system in which they have to have this sense of super heightened self-importance, because if you are not dominating others and crushing others, you are being crushed. So this is the whole kind of culture going on at the time that generates students that are like 14, 15 years old shooting each other over a duel over some petty slight. This is the kind of thing.
Faulkner wrote about this too, in that immortal character he created in Thomas Sutpen and Absalom. Who is Thomas Sutpen? Thomas Sutpen is that guy who arrives out in Alabama with a group of Haitian slaves with him. He treats them like an absolute tyrant. He carves down the forest. He begins to cultivate the land, and he declares what you gotta have for success in the South is a house, some land, and some niggers. That's another one of those sentences by Faulkner that sort of captured this spirit of Alabama fever, as it was called, in the 1820s and 30s, and Mississippi fever in the 1830s, Louisiana-Texas fever by the Louisiana fever is even earlier, but Texas fever by the 1840s. The land was so rich, and it was really cheap at first.
So you see the economic nature of the westward expansion is it's rich soils to be plundered. I think that's the mentality driving the slave class further west.
I mean, in competition with, people who want homesteads, people who want farms. I mean, the dream of every, peasant since the dawn of time is to get your own land somehow, some way. And there was an opportunity and a real push for this during this time of antebellum, pre-Civil War. And this was a major issue with the challenge of the Southern slave planting elite, is that you have this huge class of people that want land, and there's all this land right here, but I want this for my slave plantation. I'm going to need tons of it to become profitable. And all these yeoman farmers were like, hey, I want some. And they ended up fighting, being a lot of privates in the Union Army.
Bleeding Kansas and all that of what would be slave and what would be free, and these forces going in direct battle with each other, in the frontier.
Yeah.
Sea Island cotton, the kind of cotton grown down there in the Georgia, where it was first grown in North America, in the Georgia, South Carolina islands, was a kind of long and silky kind of cotton. They weren't very successful in growing it in huge amounts. But that short staple cotton that eventually was the form of cotton that the cotton gin made into such a massive, marketable
industry, invention, science, technology combined did this. If you would have continued to do that, South, you would not have had a Civil War.
Yeah. And eventually it would just become utterly absurd, right? If you were driving diesel-powered tractors on one part of land and, the slaves were over on the other part of the land. You'd be like, I can't even compete on this on the basis of just the economics of it just totally don't work out, period, in the story, So that's why the backward-lookingness also was fostered, right? Because, technology was on a course to just devastate this method of economics, just as a fundamental fact. So,
by the 1820s, already, within a decade of the War of 1812 and the opening of the frontier, cotton's future seemed limitless. And one of the best analogies you can think of is the oil-rich nations of the world in post-World War II, in the post-World War II era, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iraq and Iran, the Emirates, or Venezuela, today Russia. If you're an oil-rich country today, as long as that oil lasts, you got the world kind of at your knees. You're in OPEC. And that is exactly what the South began to see itself as, at least Southern leadership began to see itself as early as the 1820s and 1830s. The cotton crop nearly doubled every decade from 1820 to 1860. 4 decades in a row, the production of American cotton nearly doubled. Now think of another product in American history that doubled every decade for 4 decades, and then imagine that product became the country's, without question, absolute largest export.
But remember what we were talking about for exports before, is that they're just a fraction of
the domestic market.
Mm-hmm. So important, certainly, but not, the hegemon of the United States economy at the time.
Yeah, but for the model of Saudi Arabia, like that's all there is, right? Because that's all their riches are based on. So that's all they care about is just boosting that export market. So once again, the fundamental impossibility of it.
General Motors at its height, when I was growing up in Flint, Michigan, in boom times, would have wished it could have said that.
I was comparing it to Flint, Michigan when he was a kid, wish they could have said that. Yeah, industrial progress is limited by technology, discovering certain physical processes that unlock that. So it is explosive at times, but also kind of plateaus in different areas. It has to be, you have to find other technologies that can solve other problems and things like that. So, extraction-based, resource-based economics.
Little value added.
Already by 1825, that early, the South was the world's largest supplier of cotton and fueling now this industrial revolution in textile production in Great Britain and other places. I don't know if you can see those colors much at all. Sorry about that. But what you've got at the top are the early 1790 and the 1820 in terms of slave population in the American South. But if you look at 1860, the bottom map, if you can vaguely see those deep, dark red areas, you can see where cotton moved, where slavery moved in the domestic slave trade, and then where Southern political power moved. And you will find, as we will in the next few weeks, that Southern political power by the 1850s and 1860s is really no longer in Virginia or even South Carolina. It's out in the Mississippi Valley. There's a very good reason Jefferson Davis becomes president of the Confederacy in 1860. It's because he's from Mississippi. Now, fortunes were made overnight. New wealth overnight. A number of men, as one historian has written, I think quite effectively, mounted from log cabin to mansion, I quote, on a stairway of cotton bales, accumulating slaves as they went. If you had 5 slaves and a good piece of land in Alabama in 1820, you might very likely have 50 slaves and a hell of a lot more land a decade later. But it's also worth knowing that slave-holding population was also fluid. People moved in and out of it. There were approximately 400,000 slaveholders, white slaveholders, in the American South by 1860. About 1/3 of Southern white families at one time or another had at least a toehold in slave ownership. That means 2/3 did not, of course. 2/3 of the white South remained in those classes we've come to call the yeoman farmers, the poor whites, or the sandhill farmers, as they were sometimes called.
Notice sandhill farmer kind of confirms what Henry Carey was talking about in his population growth theories, that if you're a poor farmer, you don't live on, you aren't able to get to the fertile soils in the valley. You're up in the hills somewhere. Mm-hmm. forming some kind of clearing or meadow or something like that, rock slide, that you can get to some soils that way.
In certain regions of the South, the yeoman farmer non-slaveholding but landowning usually, and in the poor white farmer non-slaveholding but usually not even landowning, usually renting or working for wage labor, were 40, 50, and even 60% of the white population in a given region.
Those are the ones who are going to go die in Chattanooga.
Yeah. Those are the ones that's the white rage back then, and the white rage now is the same thing. A bunch of people getting extracted, not knowing where they're getting hurt from.
And since they're
being duped by their people that are exploiting them, their local oligarchy.
The people that exploit them also pay some clowns to come out and entertain them and tell them who is attacking them when it's someone totally not that person. And then, Pied Piper lead them to their own demise. So, same thing. If you're not, willing to educate yourself on this stuff, just forget about it. You're going to be a slave, and that's just the historical constant. So,
Jefferson Davis is, in fact, a classic example of the cotton boom planter. He was born in relatively meager and humble circumstances in Kentucky, about 80 miles from where Abraham Lincoln was born, in even meager circumstances. But his older brother Joseph went out to Mississippi and struck it rich in cotton. And Jefferson Davis went out to join him, and Jefferson Davis became a millionaire on cotton. Of course, Jefferson Davis really preferred to be a military officer and went to West Point and on and on and on. The rest is history. My watch says I've run out of time. Now let me leave you with this. How successful was the cotton boom? How important was the cotton boom? What is the relationship between the spread of slavery, the spread of cotton, and power? By 1860, there were approximately 4 million slaves in the United States, the second largest slave society, slave population in the world. The only one larger was Russian serfdom. Brazil was close. But in 1860, American slaves, as a financial asset, were worth approximately $3.5 billion. That's just as property. $3.5 billion was the net worth, roughly, of slaves in 1860. In today's dollars, that would be approximately $75 billion. In 1860, slaves as an asset were worth more than all of America's manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States put together. Slaves were the single largest, by far, financial asset of property in the entire American economy. The only thing worth more than the slaves in the American economy of the 1850s was the land itself. And no one can really put a dollar value on all of the land of North America. If you're looking to begin to understand why the South will begin to defend this system, defend this society, and worry about its shrinking, and worry about a political culture from the North that is really beginning to criticize them. Think $3.5 billion and the largest financial asset in American society, and what you might even try to compare that to today. Now, I'll pick up with this next Tuesday. It's a perfect transition into the pro-slavery argument and the Southern worldview. Thank you.
So there you go. If you didn't think that the Southern slaveholding oligarchs were going to go to war over maintaining an asset class of, fictitious financial resources that was bigger than the rest of the entire economy combined, then you're pretty naive. And like in modern times, if you don't think that the existing imperial oligarchy of the United States is not going to go to war over maintaining a $2 quadrillion asset bubble of derivatives, you're insane. So these forces, this is why they see war as such a expedient way to maintain power and hegemony. And also, it just totally exposes the Calhounian, the revisionist the South was the victim of Northern tariffs and meddling and encroachment and all this stuff. Just look at the numbers, right? Look at the dominant economic force that existed. It was the Southern, by the opening of the Civil War. He says it right there. It was worth more than the entire industrial production, railroads, everything.
Yeah, well, lots of industrial production was put on ice by the end of the Whig system and Jackson's destruction of the banking system. And you had the up and down chaotic markets of the 1830s, 1840s.
Yeah.
Lack of development.
Yeah, right. And so the fact that the slave system is even the dominant force there is the result of it maintaining its power and position. Mm-hmm. Even in the late 1850s, that was already just beginning to change with the advancement, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That was starting to shift, and that's why this kind of thing all came to a head, is that they realized that there was with the Lincoln getting elected, that there was no way that they were going to be able to maintain hegemony, basically, anymore, and that was something that they weren't willing to part with. So war was a natural result. Now what is the analogy to modern times, right? The dollar hegemony, the $2 quadrillion plus dollars of derivatives, fictitious assets that aren't actually worth anything. Like an asset of a slave, in terms of its financial value, is fictitious because it actually is negative real economics. Like where you're destroying them, you're destroying labor, you're oppressing them. It's unhuman. So, same kind of thing. We exist in the same kind of crisis. So that's our podcast for this week. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, if you like it, please share it on Facebook, Google+, Twitter. Send a link to a friend. In terms of advertising, a single extra listener costs us about $2 or $3 if we wanted to pay for it. So while it might not seem like much to share it on Facebook, it actually makes a huge difference. So thanks for listening, and hope to see you again next week.
Thank you.